How might generative AI take the ideas behind open education even further? We're exploring what that could mean for higher ed. Welcome to Speaking of Higher Ed. I'm Andrew Everett, and this is episode 36. Today, you'll hear from Dr. David Wiley, Associate Professor and Academic Affairs Fellow for AI in Education at Marshall University. Dr. Wiley, often called a pioneer of the open educational resources movement, joins us to discuss the intersection of openness, pedagogy, and generative AI. Now, here's my colleague, Arthur Takahashi, with the full conversation.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Speaking of Higher Ed. Our guest today is Dr. David Wiley, Associate Professor and Academic Affairs Fellow for AI in Education at Marshall University. Dr. Wiley is widely recognized as one of the founders of the Open Educational Resources Movement, or OER movement. In 1998, he created one of the first open licenses for content, and that work helped pave the way for the Creative Commons licenses that we know and many of us use today. He's held fellowships with Creative Commons and also with Stanford's Center for Internet and Society, and his work lives at the intersection of generative AI, open education, entrepreneurship, instructional design, and student success. He's been a creative force for innovation in education, co-founding organizations such as Lumen Learning, Degreed, and Mountain Heights Academy. Dr. Wiley, welcome to our podcast. We are super excited to have you in our episode today.
Thanks. I'm super excited to be here. I appreciate the invitation.
All right. So the first question that I have for you, and that's usually the question that we start our podcast, is asking our guests, how you have gotten to the position that you are in today. So kind of tell us a little bit about your journey through education, instructional design, and also open education, and finally generative AI.
Sure. Well, let's see. At a very high level, my undergraduate degree is in music from Marshall University. This was in the mid-1990s. And I was a student on campus. I was a student when the internet first came to campus. So I remember the time pre-internet and then post-internet and saw those changes, and spent some time working as the first university webmaster at Marshall back in the 90s. And when I finished my degree in music, I realized that my real love, I love music a lot, but I was really enjoying the work I was doing, around technology and education. So I went and did a PhD in instructional psychology and technology at Brigham Young, which is kind of part instructional design, part computer science, part ed research, kind of an amalgamation of a program, terrific program. And then for a dozen years, I worked as a tenure track faculty. 1 year as a postdoc at Utah State, and then as tenure track faculty at Utah State, and then again at Brigham Young, teaching instructional design, open education, grant writing, some kind of social entrepreneurship for instructional design or ed people with an interest in ed tech, classes like that. And then, so let's see, so I finished my PhD in 2000, and then at the end of 2012, a friend of mine and I, Kim Thanos, started Lumen Learning, which you mentioned a moment ago. And so after a dozen years kind of inside the academy, doing some entrepreneurship things on the side, I flipped over and became full-time entrepreneur working with Kim in our startup, but continued to teach as an adjunct on the side because I couldn't really extract myself from higher ed because I just love teaching too much. And then just to put a bow on it and not go too long in this story, just this past summer in 2025, I flipped back over, and now I'm back full-time at a university, back at Marshall University, where I did my undergrad here in West Virginia, and now teaching in a department that covers marketing, management information systems, and entrepreneurship. And I teach primarily in MIS and the entrepreneurship parts of the program.
Okay. So back in 1998, when you first created this open license, certainly one of the first, but perhaps maybe the first open license for content ever. What are some things that you've learned back then that kind of has guided your thinking to this day?
I think the thing that I was most excited about during that period was I had a realization one day, and I was not the first person to understand this. A lot of people before me had understood this. Economists have a whole vocabulary for it and way of talking about it. But I remember I was working as the webmaster at Marshall University, like I was talking about. So this would have been in '97. And I was developing a JavaScript calculator to go in a web page, which was the very height of high tech at the time. And I just remember having this moment of realizing that JavaScript calculator was very different from a physical calculator. And that maybe if you're in a classroom that only has 5 physical calculators, you have to wait for maybe as an elementary school student or something, you have to wait for the calculator to come around to get your turn kind of working on it. But when you take that same capability and you make it digital and post it online, 1 million people can all use it at the same time. And that just seemed so transformative and powerful to me, that idea that if we can figure out how to create, if we can find the resources to create the thing and post it online, then everyone could benefit from it for a very long time after that. So it wasn't very long after I had that realization that the group, in February of 1998, a group of people got together to have a strategy session about what was going on with what at the time was called free software. And coming out of that February meeting, they said, we think free software is a problematic name and brand for a couple of reasons, and we want to try to rebrand it as open source software and talk about the very pragmatic benefits that you get from sharing and being open in that way. And so I was really inspired by that work, and that work together with that realization around the calculator led me to create that first open license and really start advocating, for anything that's not software, can be covered by these open content licenses like the Creative Commons license. But my real interest has always been in education. So if we can find the funding to create that textbook, then we can put it online and it can bless the lives of millions of people, right? It can even be translated into other languages because of the 5R permissions you get with open licenses and things like that. But just this idea that technology plus licensing can allow us to share and be generous in this way that was never possible before, that's really the kind of the initial motivating thing for me back then that has carried through my work until today.
Yeah, and that kind of leads me into the next question, because you've actually given us a lot of the vocabulary that we still use in open pedagogy and the open education today. So one of the things that I had always heard and then learned that it came from you, but the idea of the 5 Rs. So you've defined OER through the 5R permissions. For the listeners and the viewers who don't know what those 5R permissions of OER, what they actually are, could you just briefly explain what they are and how impactful they can be for pedagogy?
Sure. So the 5 Rs, I'll just list them real quick and then I'll define them, are retain, and then revise, remix, reuse, and redistribute. And so retain means that, and let me step back even further to say when you're looking at an educational resource, it could be a video, could be a textbook chapter, whatever. If you have permission to engage in these 5R activities, then I would say that resource is an OER. So the first of those is retain. And what retain means is you have to be able to download your own copy of that resource and keep it forever, and then be able to do certain other things with it. And retain, initially the framework was the 4 Rs framework, and it was 4 Rs for several years. And then as business models started changing with Netflix, with Spotify, with academic publishers and libraries not wanting to sell you DVDs or sell you music or sell you journals, but just rent access to them, it became clear that if we ended up in a world where I could only access things, but I could never own things, I wouldn't be able to do the 4R. I wouldn't be able to revise, remix, redistribute, and reuse. And so I added this fifth R, which turns out to be prerequisite to the other four. You have to be able to make your own copy, download it, and keep it. And it can't delete itself after 6 months like a textbook rental might do off of your Kindle or something else. It has to be real, just old-fashioned, private property. You control your copy. Then with that copy, you can do these four other things. You can revise it, which means you can open it up and fiddle with its insides. You might want to adjust the reading level because it's written at a high reading level, and maybe your students have a slightly lower reading level, so you want to adjust it down. You can edit it, maybe take out some examples that are in there, put new examples in that speak more directly to your students. So revise is the first. Remix is the second, and that's where I can take two or more openly licensed things and make one new thing out of them. And if they're all openly licensed in compatible ways, then remixing is something that I can do. The third of those original four R's is reuse. So either with the verbatim copy that I made originally, or my revised copy, or my remixed copy, I have to be able to go out into the world and use it publicly, whether it's in my class or in a talk that I'm giving or on a YouTube video that I might want to post publicly. I have to be able to publicly display and use the object or the resource. And then the last one is redistribute. I have to be able to give other people permission to download what I've created, and that's them retaining, and then the whole cycle starts again. So those are the 5 R's.
And you've also defined a different kind of pedagogy based on those 5 R's. Initially, you called that open pedagogy, but you changed the term to OER-enabled pedagogy. For faculty who don't know what OER-enabled pedagogy is, could you briefly explain that term? Sure.
So the kind of the simplest definition there is anything you can do in support of teaching and learning. That's kind of the pedagogy part of it. Anything you can do in support of teaching and learning when you have 5 R permissions in the resources that you're using that you can't do without those 5 R permissions, I would say is OER. It's pedagogy that's enabled by the 5 R's of OER. So for example, if in the past I have adopted an open textbook and then worked with my students over a series of semesters to rewrite the textbook. I mentioned a minute ago changing out examples in the textbook. So the first time I did this was in a project management class I was teaching. And the examples were all kind of written for a business school context, and they weren't relating to my students who are instructional designers. So we pulled all those examples out and wrote new examples of project management that an instructional designer might care about. So you're working with a SME who's supposed to be writing assessment items for you, and they're late. What are you going to do now? So that's a process. That's a kind of pedagogy of rewriting the core course materials that I can engage in when my course materials are licensed in a way that gives me those 5 R permissions. That's something I can't do if I would have adopted traditionally copyrighted material, or TCM, which is the opposite of OER. And so there's a family of things that you can do when you've adopted OER that you can't do when you've adopted TCM. And that's what OER-enabled pedagogy is about.
Yeah. And one of the things that I have read in some of your blog posts and seen in some of your presentations is this relationship between OER-enabled pedagogy and constructionist theory. And it seems like you tend to focus on remix and revise as like great ways to do teaching and learning. But could you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, actually, in one of the papers, a graduate student of mine, John Hilton, who has gone on to become a great scholar in his own right, wrote this paper on OER-enabled pedagogy, where we looked at different kinds of assessment, what we kind of thought of as traditional assessment, authentic assessment, more constructivist approach to assessment, and then what we called a renewable assessment. And the idea there is grounded in a critique of what I somewhat jokingly refer to as disposable assessments. So a disposable assessment is, or a disposable assignment is when I ask you to do some work, and you know, and I know, that after you do the work and after I grade the work, you're going to throw away the work and never look at it again. And that seems like it's kind of a shame, because you're going to invest a lot of time and effort, I'm going to invest time and effort, and then it's going to go into the garbage can. So the idea with this renewable assessment approach was, what if we had students spend that time and effort creating things that would actually add value to the world, instead of creating things that they were going to throw away at the end of that process. And as soon as you start to talk about kind of creation as a form of learning and form of assessment, it starts to tie you into that constructionist, kind of tradition. And so in that paper, we walked through how you're kind of layering on different pieces of going from a typical assessment to one that's actually going to add value to the world through something that you are creating, revising, remixing, that then eventually you're putting an open license on, so that it can be the beginning of the next person's, authentic constructionist renewable assessment that they might do. Because all of open is about creating, revising, remixing, and sharing, so that your output can be the next person's input. And so that the effects and the benefit and the impact of that can kind of grow and propagate outward. So I don't know if that's an answer to the question you're actually asking, but that's where that connects.
And the more that I thought about that, this relationship between the 5 R's and constructionist theory, the more I keep going back to the revise and remix portions of it for cognitive learning, right? But there's also motivational aspect if you're thinking about redistributing that to the world, like adding that value to the world, as you've mentioned. Yeah. So it's just good pedagogy.
Yeah, I mean, in the constructionist framework, you could always have your students make new things, right? But in this kind of OER-enabled framework, you can have them make new things from scratch, or revise things, or remix things, right? It just unlocks more kinds of things that you can do. And there was one other thought I had, but I've lost it now. Yeah.
In your experience working in this world of open pedagogy, is there something that people tend to misunderstand about OER that perhaps we should be addressing?
Yeah, I would say the biggest misunderstanding about OER is that so many of the people that I have talked to over the years, and people in survey responses that in the results of surveys that I've seen, people think that OER are resources that are free. And this is in many ways the same problem that the free software and open source software people were kind of fighting back in the day. That name free software just confused people. And so this idea that any resource that's free is an open educational resource is problematic in a whole bunch of ways. Because if you think about it, the entire public-facing internet, 1 trillion pages, they're all free for you to access. So if an OER was just something that was free for me to access, the whole internet would be OER. We wouldn't need another word to describe it. We would just say the internet instead of saying open educational resources. A lot of the internet is traditionally copyrighted material, not OER, it's TCM. A lot of resources available in the library to students, even though they pay a fee, they pay a library fee, which may or may not be clear to them as they're paying their bundle of fees. But their experience of library resources is that they're free. But the overwhelming majority of them are also TCM, not OER. Right? So if I think, I'm going to adopt OER, and I adopt a bunch of library resources and New York Times articles from the website and other things, I can't engage in any of the 5 R's with any of those materials. I can't do any OER-enabled pedagogy. I don't get any of the flexibility. It's a very, very, very impoverished view of what open is supposed to be about. Open is supposed to be about the permissions to share and to build and revise and remix that we've been talking about. So I'd say the number one confusion is people think, oh, anything that's free is an OER. And then they say, oh, I switched my class to OER, but actually their entire class is TCM. It's freely available, but in their mind, since it's free, it's OER. And so now they think they're using OER, but they're missing all the benefits of using OER.
So it's free, but they can't apply the 5R permissions.
Right.
So something else that you've mentioned in some of your presentations as well is how there seems to be also this misconception that OER also leads to better learning. Mm-hmm. Could you address that? Because you've mentioned that there's some serious methodological issues with some of the research that point to that. But in addition to that, like how could faculty, instructors, think of using OER to really enhance learning? If OER on its own cannot enhance learning.
Right. Well, maybe the best way to think about that is let me grab a textbook off the shelf here. So here's a book about how to write assessments that I used when I taught the assessment course. So this book, to some greater or lesser degree, we could do research and find out what degree it is, but to some degree supports student learning of this content, right? Now, if I open this book and I go to the copyright page here near the front, and if I scratch out, let's just imagine that I actually had legal permission to do this. I scratch out where it says copyright, and I write in Creative Commons attribution. Okay, so now it's an OER. Is it more effective now than it was 30 seconds ago when it was a TCM?
Cognitively speaking, no. Right?
It's literally exactly the same, right? So there's kind of no reason to believe that just because something is open is going to make it more effective than it being traditionally copyrighted. And even, there were advocates in the open space for a while, and you'll actually still hear some of them make this argument. I guess they don't know the research. But for a while, there was kind of a line of thought that said, if a textbook is too expensive for me to be able to afford it, then I'm not going to be able to learn the things I need to learn. And so even though it's cognitively the same, whether I have access to it or not makes such a big difference that I'll be able to go conduct research and find out that if you assign OER and I assign TCM, your students are going to do better than mine because more of them will have access to it. But there's a really terrific paper out of OpenStax several years ago, led by their director of research, that kind of took the reader through a little more carefully through that thinking. And they said, imagine a typical, now I'm kind of summarizing obviously here, but if you imagine a typical class with 50 students in it, how many of those students are either going to be able to afford the book or borrow one from a friend or access one at the library or even whatever method they're going to use? How many of them are going to be able to get access to the book one way or another versus the students that will literally have zero access for the entire semester? And that second group is going to be pretty small. So out of 50 students, say it's 5. So when that instructor adopts OER, the increase in access only happens for 10% of the students. It doesn't affect the other 45 students. They were going to find some way to get access to the course. So now, I've got this population, and from like a research perspective, like I've given my treatment to 10% of them, and now I want to measure the entire population and look to see if there's a noticeable change in their learning. Well, those 45 students aren't going to have any change attributable to access because they were going to have access before. Yep. Mm-hmm. These last 5, maybe their grades will go from 50% to 90% or 50% to 95%. But having 5 students out of 50 experience that kind of growth is very, very, very rarely going to show up when you go to do a research study. It's just not enough of a difference given how big the whole group is. And you don't know ahead of time who those students would be to try to isolate them into a subgroup or something like that. So this OpenStax research talks about what they call the access hypothesis, that if we increase access, we'll be able to see measurable gains in student learning. And then they show why most of the time it's just not true. So when you do see an instructor who's adopted OER, faculty using OER, compared to other faculty who aren't using OER, and you see this big difference in the amount of learning that's happening there, the odds are extraordinarily high that what's driving that difference is not the licensing of the materials. It's maybe this teacher. It just so happens that the teacher who adopted OER also does a lot of active learning in their classroom, and the faculty who adopted TCM just lectures all the time. There are so many other factors that affect student learning other than just the licensing of the textbook that the instructor chooses, that if you go back and look at these studies, and I recently I wrote about this and kind of said there are three questions to ask yourself when you read research about OER efficacy. The first is, if it is based on this idea of the kind of access hypothesis that the OpenStax team outlined, has the researcher done anything to try to determine ahead of time how much of the population do we really believe ought to be affected by it, instead of pretending that the entire class will benefit from OER adoption, because the majority of them are going to have access to the material anyway. The second question is to ask about whether there was any randomization or any attempt to establish equivalence between the teachers in the two groups. Because almost every research study you'll read compares faculty who've adopted OER to faculty who adopt TCM, but they make those choices themselves. I choose to adopt OER, I choose to adopt TCM. I'm not put into a randomly assigned group. Most studies don't do any kind of like propensity score matching to say this faculty is kind of equivalent to this one, so we'll match them up. So what you get is, it's like doing a health study where people get to choose whether they want to exercise or not. But you don't randomly assign them. Then you go look and see, was one group healthier than another? Well, surprise, the group who chose to exercise was healthier than the group who didn't choose to. So the effect of the teacher is perfectly confounded with the effect of the material that they have chosen. And then the second question is to ask, is there any control for teacher effect? And then the third question is there any control in the study for the instructional design of the materials or of the pedagogy that's used in the classroom? And you could imagine 10 other questions that you could ask. But if you just ask those three, go think of your favorite OER research study that shows an improvement in student learning, and then ask those three questions. And the answer to all three of the questions is probably no. And if it's no, if the answer to any of them is no, then the paper doesn't actually tell you that OER causes a difference. It tells you that OER might cause a difference, or teachers might cause a difference, or OER might cause a difference, or instructional design might cause a difference. So I've been trying to encourage researchers in the field to be more rigorous in the design of their studies. There have been a handful of really, what I would consider really well-designed, rigorously controlled studies, and they showed no significant difference, which is what we would expect, because if I change the copyright page out of the book and I keep the teacher the same, the instructional design the same, everything else the same, we ought to expect the outcomes to be the same. So to the second part of your question about what should we do in order to try to improve outcomes, is there's a whole body of research around what are called evidence-based teaching practices, ways of teaching that we know from good research are associated with better student outcomes. So I think the question with OER is, when I have OER, which is only different from TCM in that it gives me these 5R permissions, right? How can I leverage those 5R permissions in order to implement more of these evidence-based teaching practices, because I know that this works, but maybe I wasn't able to implement it before because the way my curriculum was designed was at odds with this evidence-based practice. Now, if I have permission to make these changes, then I can change the open textbook or whatever OER I'm using to enact more of these evidence-based practices. Then we should expect to see differences in outcomes because we're using more evidence-based practices in our teaching.
And I think that's a perfect transition to the next part of the conversation, which is with the advent of generative AI. Mm-hmm. How has that changed your approach to OER and also OER-enabled pedagogy?
So I will admit that this is still a topic that I'm actively thinking about. And I think that's true for most people. I mean, AI is still advancing very rapidly. There's new capabilities all the time. And as an educational technologist, I just look at every new capability. Like, how can I use that capability, to drive student learning better? I'll say that probably the primary way that it's changed my thinking about OER is about what's the right word? Ideal is a little too strong, but what should the ideal OER look like? And I think maybe 3 years ago, we would have said, it looks like a textbook, or it looks like courseware, like a MyLab or something like that, but it's openly licensed. That's what the ideal OER is. Now, today, and toward the end of 2025, I think the ideal OER looks more like a very, very sophisticated prompt, maybe 2,000 or 3,000 words long, that I can give to my students that they can enter into a generative AI, and then they might experience a 20 or 30-minute long interactive study session where explanations are customized to things that they care about and find interesting or relevant. There's lots of formative assessment along the way. Misunderstandings are diagnosed kind of right as they happen and corrected. The idea that if I could take a fixed amount of time and write kind of like a traditional OER where I individually write every word that a student will ever read, I call it an open textbook, and I give it to them, there's a certain amount of learning that can happen there. But if I spend that same amount of time writing a prompt that can create a customized version of that experience for every student who interacts with it, that seems like it's a much better use of my time to, instead of writing a textbook chapter, to write a prompt that would lead a student through a conversation about all the topics that would have been in that chapter. But we'll begin by asking them, tell me some things you're interested in. Oh, you like music? You like basketball? You like hiking? Okay, those are the examples I'll use as I explain these topics to you. Now, okay, we just finished talking about this. Let me ask you a question. What do you think the relationship between supply and demand really is about? Open-ended answer. So that first part was right, but the second part isn't quite right. Let me tell you more about the second part. Right, that whole, just that conversational learning. To me, that's what the future of OER is about creating those prompts as opposed to creating static textbook chapters. Mm-hmm. In addition to, there are a number of what they call open weights models, language models, where you can actually revise and remix the AI itself, the language model, to get it to behave more pedagogically, to have more disciplinary knowledge, things like that. So I'm very excited about the kind of next generation of OER being these prompts that are openly licensed so that they can be revised and remixed, because maybe I'm using ChatGPT and you're using Claude and you're going to need to refine it a little bit to get the results that you want. But also these open models that you can download and run right on your desktop or right on your laptop that are private, because they run locally and no data ever goes up into the cloud. Power usage kind of implications, because I'm just doing it on my laptop instead of up in the cloud again. Mm-hmm. I think I think it's a kind of a complete reconceptualization of what OER really looked like. Because in the past, we've created a static artifact and we've applied an open license to it. Then we've told people, you can take this artifact and make all the copies of it that you want. But now instead of creating static artifacts, we can create recipes for experiences. And we can openly license those and distribute those. And instead of my learning experience being, reading 10 pages of static words, it can be very conversational, and I can explore what I'm curious about and poke and prod at this and get corrections when my understanding is inaccurate. Like, that just seems so much more powerful to me. And that's certainly what I've been doing in the OER creation work that I've been doing, and encouraging anybody who will listen to do the same.
Yeah, so there are a lot of things going on in your answer here that I'm super excited about. So this idea of having prompts as OER and us as instructors publishing those prompts, and also open weights, that's what you call generative OER, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And the idea of creating the prompts and assigning the prompts to our students, you've mentioned this concept of generative textbook. Is that what you're referring to when you talk about these prompts?
So when I talk about the prompts, so I would say that there are, so there's a site, generativetextbooks.org, where I'm doing some active experimenting with this idea.
Okay.
That you can go and look at. And what you'll see there is that basically as a learner, I come in and say, this is the generative textbook I want to study from, and this is the chapter that I want to study, and this is the kind of learning activity that I want to do. I either want to have a conversation, or I want the AI to build me on the fly an interactive simulation where I can slide sliders and change variables and see how causal relationships play out between different concepts. Or the third is a retrieval practice kind of exercise where the practice quiz isn't multiple choice, but it's all open-ended, and there's immediate feedback along the way. And if you think about kind of those three choices that the learner makes, they're really kind of establishing the context plus the prompt, and then you have the weights on the other side of it. So the prompt says, here's the activity I want to engage in. Have a conversation with me where you explain. You know what a prompt looks like, right? But you also, together with that prompt, you have to combine it with enough context so that the model can give you accurate responses. So if you play around on the generative-textbook.org site, you'll see that what the context looks like is a detailed set of learning outcomes. Here are all the outcomes that we need, or objectives. I know people have strong feelings about objectives versus outcomes, but essentially here are all the things that I need to learn, right? And then below that, what looks more like an encyclopedia entry, something just very kind of dry and factual, just kind of information about each of those learning outcomes, so that when the model generates its answer, it has a high quality reference that it can look to find the information it uses to generate the answer. So I'd say you need the context plus the prompts together. And then you can use the context and the prompts. You can use them with a proprietary model or with an open weights model. Right now, when you play around in the site, you'll see that it builds up it aggregates all the context and the prompt into kind of one chunk of text. And then it lets you choose which AI model you'd like to work with. And then sends you off to that it copies all of that context and the prompt into your clipboard and sends you off to whichever model you choose. You might choose ChatGPT, and then when you get there, you just hit paste and enter, and then the learning experience starts.
So for our viewers and listeners, is that resource openly licensed as well? Can they go and incorporate that into their courses? Yeah,
so the generative-textbooks.org, the source code, the software that runs that site is all openly licensed. All the prompts that are in there are openly licensed. All of the context is openly licensed. There's a no-code authoring tool where it looks very much like Pressbooks. Like there are boxes and you put text in the boxes and you hit save. So if you can use Pressbooks, you can use, or WordPress or anything else like that. You can use a tool like this.
So that's a great resource.
Anybody can register. There's no, it's all open. Yeah.
And, another thing that comes to mind with these more personalized learning experiences is something that you also alluded to in some of your presentations, but it's Benjamin Bloom's Two Sigma problem, right? That's what comes to mind. So if you could perhaps explain what that is and how perhaps this could be a solution to that problem?
Yeah. So so Bloom's Two Sigma problem. So Bloom and his, I believe his graduate students wrote a series of papers. They did a series of research studies that culminated in this 1984 paper that Bloom wrote called the Two Sigma problem. And in that body of research, what they found was that there are two changes that you could make that would radically improve student learning. The first is that you could start using a mastery-based approach with students. And what a mastery-based approach, let me contrast it first with a typical approach. A typical approach, this week we're doing chapter 7, and at the end of the week we take the chapter 7 quiz, and if you fail, that's too bad for you, because on Monday we start chapter 8. And you just kind of move through the course that way. And you only get, you take the chapter 7 quiz one time. And if you fail it, you fail it. But we're moving on because Monday's chapter 8. A mastery-based approach looks more like, I'm going to take the chapter 7 quiz. It's going to show me the things I've mastered and things I haven't mastered yet. I might get some feedback about the topics I haven't mastered yet, be able to go back and study some more, and then come back and try a different version of that assessment and be able to go through that loop. However many times it takes me to learn, let me take as many times as it takes me to learn to be able to achieve mastery. So the first thing that Bloom Bloom and his colleagues was change from a traditional approach to a mastery-based approach. And then the second thing that they did was the students in the treatment group were either were tutored, but I don't mean like an after-school tutor, like from 8 to 3 all day long. Their learning experience all day, every day was working one-on-one with a tutor, or maybe 1-on-2, 1-on-3, very small group. And what he found is that if you combine those two things, if you take the mastery-based approach and this kind of one-on-one or one-on very small group tutoring approach, and you look at the grades that students receive after their learning experiences, students in the treatment group and students in the control group, the average student, so if you think about the bell curve, the average student in the group that used the mastery-based tutorial approach learned as much as the 98th percentile student in the traditional classroom setting. And it was about 2 standard deviations more than average, which is why it goes by the 2 sigma name, because sigma is the letter that's used to designate standard deviations. So that seems like a super exciting finding. Like there's something we can do that can take the average kid and make him outperform 98% of other kids. But they called it the 2 sigma problem because we can barely afford to put one teacher in front of 40 kids. There's no way to give every kid their own individual tutor all day long, every day. So there's what I think is one of the most inspiring paragraphs anywhere in research in this 84 paper of Bloom's, where he calls the field. He says, look, we've shown that kids are capable of learning so much more than they're currently learning. And the reason that they're not is us, because we can't figure out how to provide this to them. So if someone could come up with some way to replicate this kind of mastery-based tutorial approach, but in a way that can work in a normal classroom, used by a normal teacher, he says, with little or no more cost and little or no additional training, then like that would be miraculous, basically. And so it's this kind of call to everybody to take up this work. Mm-hmm. So understanding that for folks who are listening, it probably becomes kind of obvious what the connection between that and generative AI is, because there's a lot of talk about generative AI acting as a tutor. Mm-hmm. And if generative AI can be an effective tutor, then could that be one of the answers to this challenge that Bloom laid out for all of us? Now, I don't know that there are a lot of people who are excited about the prospect of sitting and typing to your tutor all day long and not interacting with another human being. That doesn't seem like it's a great learning experience. So there's, it's not just as simple as saying, oh, make a chatbot, and now we've solved Bloom's 2 Sigma problem. Because part of why it works with a tutor is you establish that relationship, and there's a human dynamic there that when you study closely with a person over time that develops. But it's certainly, generative AI definitely feels like the most promising kind of attack vector that we've had on Bloom's 2 Sigma problem in a while. It seems like there ought to be a way that we can take generative AI, change it, wrap some other things around it, and use that in order to make real progress on getting, helping students really learn all that they can learn, helping them really achieve their potential.
So on that note, from an instructional design standpoint, and I know you've taught instructional design in generative AI in the past, I think it was last year, right? Generative AI for instructional designers.
Instructional designers, yeah.
Yeah. So what would be your kind of suggestion or recommendation for IDs, instructional designers, or even instructors, right, who are designing their own courses when it comes to Gen AI and OER?
Well, it's going to be very closely related to the question from a few minutes ago about how can we use OER to actually improve student outcomes, which is to say, go back to that base of research about evidence-based teaching practices and think about how could I enact this evidence-based teaching practice using generative AI? Because, so I already mentioned retrieval practice. Let's talk about retrieval practice for a minute. Students love practice quizzes, practice exams. They love to be able to do that. They take a ton of effort to put together on our part, which is why we don't generally give them as many practice exams as they would like for us to. But and we know that kind of retrieval practice is just about the highest kind of ROI on your study time compared to any other technique, like rereading the parts of the textbook that you've highlighted, just ineffective. Right. Yeah. So go back to that research about what really is going to drive student learning and see, ask yourself, how could I leverage all these new capabilities I have in generative AI and with the OER that I might use together with generative AI? How can I enact these practices at a greater scale or more often? So I'll give you an example. I'm teaching an Intro to Databases class this semester. It's one of the MIS classes here at Marshall. And it's this exact problem, which is why it's on my mind. Students were asking, is there going to be a practice midterm? Or is there going to be a practice midterm? Are we going to have a chance to practice? And so I won't take you through my whole thought process, but where it ended was I sat down and wrote a series of prompts, and I tweaked and refined each of those prompts until I could get the prompt to generate a question that I would feel comfortable including on the midterm. So this midterm is very project-based. It's around doing database design tasks and data normalization tasks. It's not multiple choice questions. It's like, here's a database diagram, read and interpret it, the kinds of things. So I worked on these prompts and worked on them until I got comfortable that they were creating good questions. And then I worked on them some more. And then I went into class one day and I said, these are the prompts that I'm going to use to create the questions on the midterm. here are the prompts, you can take them and you can use them to generate an infinite number of practice midterms, as many as you want. And my commitment to you is that the questions that show up on the midterm, I will generate also using these prompts. And so I made the midterm from those prompts, and they made, I don't know how many practice midterms from those prompts. But instead of investing the work, again, in creating like a finite, 3 specific questions for a midterm and 3 other versions of that question for the midterm, I spent the time on the prompts. Right? And because I spent the time on the prompts, they're able to generate all the practice midterms they want. And if I'd had a student who had missed that day and I wanted to give them a different form of the midterm, 60 seconds, I have another form of the official midterm that I can use as well, right?
Yeah, love that.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you could fund one study next year to advance generative OER, or somehow incorporating Gen AI and OER together, what would that study try to test or answer?
Ooh.
Like unlimited budget, like anything you want to do, like what would be your ideal study?
I think tomorrow I may have a different answer, but are you familiar with the idea of stealth assessment?
No.
From gaming research. So people who look at game-based learning have this idea of stealth assessment, which is that, like, if I design this game that's supposed to help you learn a certain number of skills or some knowledge, then it's kind of jolting to play this game and learn all these things and then turn around and sit down and take a quiz, right? In theory, if the game is really teaching you and giving you opportunities to practice all the things you're supposed to learn, your behavior in the game is leaving traces of what you know. And I can actually, you can play the game and then I can go back and review the gameplay and use that as the assessment. So the assessment's totally invisible. Like, you don't even realize that you're being tested because you're just playing the game. But as you play the game, you're leaving these traces of, did I know this? Did I know how to do that? Was I able to? Was I not able to? So you play the game, and then the gameplay data can be used for assessment purposes. So I'm really, because there's a lot of conversation, obviously, about assessment and generative AI and cheating and academic integrity and things like that. I'm really interested in the idea that there is a version of stealth assessment that can happen in the context of conversational learning with a generative AI. So if it's teaching me a topic and asking me a question and I'm asking it to follow up and we're having this conversation about the topics that I would have just been reading about in the textbook, at the end of that conversation, can I take the transcript for that conversation and go back and trace the learning for all the different topics? And I'm just going to assume that maybe you didn't know anything at the start, but can I see those traces and where they get to? And at the end, can the learning experience, the learning conversation that you had, can that also serve as the assessment? Instead of you doing that and then turning around and taking a quiz. If I could fund anything myself, I think I would fund a study looking at a couple of things. One of them would be, like, how can we design the most effective conversational learning experience possible? And to what degree can we leverage the transcript of that learning experience as the assessment data, so that I come in, I have this conversation, it might last half an hour, 45 minutes, and at the end of the conversation, I'm done. My grade is done. There is no additional assessment, because as it was teaching me, it was assessing me. And so those get threaded together in a way that, like, how would you use AI to cheat on that? There's probably some way to do it, but it's certainly a lot less vulnerable to cheating than a multiple choice quiz or an essay question or something. So I think there's something real interesting there at the intersection of kind of conversation-based learning and stealth assessment. That is what I would want to fund if I had all the money in the world.
Yeah, no, I love that idea. All right, so this is my last question before our continuing the conversation question and before we go on this short break. But if you could go back in time, any point in time during your career when you started really playing with this idea of open content, right, and you could give that young David a piece of advice, what would that be?
Ooh, wow. That piece of advice would be okay, I'm going to have to explain this piece of advice. But that piece of advice would be to involve commercial publishers in that conversation far earlier than this timeline David actually did. So in the open source software world, they knew right from the very beginning that it's big companies with lots of money that fund the development of most software. And so if open source was going to really take off and become a thing and be successful, major for-profit companies were going to have to choose to open source a lot of the software that they wrote. And so they started early on having those conversations. And now IBM, Google, Facebook, they all open source so much of the software that they create. And it has made this ecosystem that has driven innovation on the internet, on devices, in just an unbelievable way. When I first started to work on open content, I really only was reaching out to instructors, to department chairs and deans, to provosts, like, can we please don't pass policies that say, because back in the early 2000s, people were like, this sharing thing sounds scary. It'll be the death of the university. We're going to not allow faculty to share their resources and things like that. So I was really focused internally, but within academia. Mm-hmm. And by the mid 2010s, when I first started, so one of the other things that I was doing back then was I was running the Open Education Conference. So I created that and ran it for 16 years. And in the mid 2010s, I started inviting Pearson, Cengage, McGraw-Hill, Macmillan, like trying to get them to come to the conference and understand why it would be good for them, how it could be good for them to start openly licensing some of the content they created. But because I hadn't done that early enough, the identity of some people in the community had come to be one not of using openness to drive student learning, but being open because commercial publishers are evil. And because commercial publishers are evil, we need to retaliate, we need to react by creating OER, we need to take them down, like they're the worst. And so that attitude had too long to kind of develop. So as I started inviting those commercial publishers in, some people in that conference community just treated them so rudely, so disrespectfully. They sponsored the conference for a year or two, and then they just, they wouldn't come back and they wouldn't engage. Mm-hmm. Like Cengage made a major announcement about an OER initiative that they were launching at the Open Education Conference. And the community basically said, open is for people who are virtuous and righteous, and you clearly are not. Why are you trying to pretend that just shut them down hard, right when they announced it. And if you look at the open source software case, and there's a report that's written every other year out of the Linux Foundation, something like 95% of all open source software is written by someone working at a for-profit company paying them to open source the software that they write. So imagine all the OER we have today, if that was just 5% of all the OER that existed, because Cengage and Pearson and these other big commercial publishers had gotten involved. It's just a huge loss for all of us. And like if I had one thing to do over again in my open career, that's what I would do. I would try to pull them in sooner before that bad attitude had really solidified. Because we still are. We're missing out on just a ton of synergy and benefit there.
Well, thank you for that answer. And all right, everyone. So we're going to go on a quick break, but stay with us. When we return, I'll ask Dr. Wiley our continuing the conversation question, and we're going to be taking a look into the future of Gen AI and OER in higher education.
Got a teaching idea worth sharing? Share it on AU Teaching Commons. We are Augusta University's first peer-reviewed hub of open teaching resources by faculty for faculty. Share your knowledge, help your peers, impact students. Visit us at guides.augusta.edu/AU Teaching Commons.
Welcome back, everyone. It's time for our continuing the conversation question. So, Dr. Wiley, as you look ahead, what gives you the most hope, and perhaps what gives you the most caution or make you pause about the intersection of Gen AI and openness in higher education?
I think probably the thing that gives me the most excitement is a combination of just how quickly the quality of the models, of generative AI models, is advancing, and how many of the major players in the generative AI space have committed themselves to sharing open weights, not for all of their models, but for some of their models. Because it's the case that the very bleeding edge frontier models will never be open source. The quality of the open source models tends to lag about a year, maybe 18 months behind the frontier models. But if I'm sitting down to learn intro to psychology, do I really need the bleeding most edge frontier model to do that, or is the open source model today good enough? And I would argue that with the right context and the right prompting, the open source models today are very good. And so the idea that that's just going to keep getting better and better, and people are going to continue to release open versions of those model weights, we're going to keep writing prompts and writing context. Like the future of OER and generative AI being open, running on my phone, running on my laptop, being able to put the model weights, the context, and the prompts on a thumb drive, drop it in an envelope, and send it to Nepal, send it to Thailand, send it to anywhere in the world where maybe there isn't reliable internet connectivity. But I can still, if I can find a computer, I can plug this in and have my own generative AI all working locally, teaching me the things I need to know, doing translation on the fly for me. It's like the vision I had of open content before, where like if we can just create that artifact the first time, if you can just find a way to fund the development of that textbook, then millions of people could benefit from it. It's very much the same, except instead of creating one static artifact, I'm creating this recipe of potential that can just go everywhere. So that's the thing that is the most exciting to me about it. The thing that gives me the most pause, I think, at least in formal education settings, is the kind of pressure I think that a lot of university leadership feels to need to adopt AI policies right now, because we still don't understand generative AI very well and how it fits into the education context. Like just agentic browsers this past summer totally changed like what online learning is going to look like in the future. Online learning is going to have to change in the face of these agentic browsers. But I worry that if we adopt policies too quickly, we're going to box ourselves into corners. There's going to be all this amazing untapped potential out here that's going to be out of reach because we've said policy-wise, you're not allowed to ever do this, that, or that. And that might make sense on the day that you say those words, but 3 months later, a year later, it's like a year is like a decade now, with the speed at which AI is advancing. I'm concerned about premature policy. Like imagine if in 1999 our universities had set policies around what is and isn't allowed with the internet. Would we even have LMSs on campus today? Would we be allowed to? YouTube didn't exist, right? Just all the stuff that came later that we could have policied ourselves into a corner on. I just have lots of concerns around kind of innovation and participation being foreclosed before we really understand what the possibilities are.
And Dr. Wiley, is there anything else that I know we talked about a lot of things, really exciting things, very enlightening conversation, but is there anything that we didn't talk about that you would like to perhaps comment on?
I think I would just say that even though there is so much kind of chaos and confusion and contention and like the world is not the happiest that it's ever been right now, the world at large. But I still think that education can be such a powerful force for good, for peace, for improving prosperity. And there has never been a more exciting time to be a learner than right now. Like with access to generative AI, the way that you can ask any kind of question that comes to mind. When you're stuck on your homework at 1 a.m., you can just get that help and keep going instead of being, log jammed the way you used to be. There's never been a more exciting time to be a learner, and I don't know that our world has ever needed educating more than it needs right now. So those two things seem like really hopeful and promising things to me. So despite all the churn and swirl that's going on, I'm pretty optimistic about the future. So I think that's the last thought maybe that I'd share.
All right. Well, Dr. Wiley, thank you so much for talking to us today. Like we were super excited to have you on the podcast, and this conversation was really, really enlightening. Thank you.
Well, and very fun for me too. Thanks for the invitation. This was great.
Thanks for listening to Speaking of Higher Ed. You can find all episodes and more on our show page at augusta.edu/innovation and continue the conversation with us at facebook.com/AUGCII. Speaking of Higher Ed is produced by the Center for Instructional Innovation at Augusta University.